Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. My name is Ken Shorja, and I'm here with London Paul. And Paul, there's some interesting things that happened when Iran decided to retaliate. They were able to hit their strategic targets with minimal casualties and damage to the civilian population. Anyway, I want to thank you as always for being a part of this discussion. And we have gone to a new escalation, but hopefully that escalation will lead to a pulling back of tensions.
Yeah, well, obviously, thanks as well for joining today, Ken. As always, it's great we do things together. But yeah, it's a very complicated subject, Israel and Iran, and obviously, by extension, what's going on with Hamas and with Hezbollah, and they're all kind of interwoven currently. And yeah, the question is, and we'll start off with the issue of the Israeli response. Now, this has been long waited. I think the anticipation was after Haniyeh, who was the Hamas leader, was obviously killed in Tehran, that the response would be prompt, and it hasn't been. It's been over 2 months, getting on for 3 months. But I think what finally triggered the Iranians was the assassination of Nasrallah, who was obviously the head of Hezbollah. And it's quite telling. And obviously, this is the statement from the Lebanese themselves. So we have to work on the basis of them, that we trust what they're saying. Where they confirm that Hezbollah had agreed to a ceasefire, because remember, for quite a long time, there's been missiles and rockets and everything fired between both respective countries, Lebanon and Israel. But apparently they'd agreed to a ceasefire, and the Lebanese government informed the US, who then said that Israel had accepted this ceasefire. And then almost immediately, Israel killed Nasrallah. Now, you can guarantee that that order was given by Netanyahu, who clearly doesn't want any ceasefire. He wants an escalation, and we know why he wants an escalation, because contrary to all reports, the war with Hamas has failed. I mean, Hamas, they may have killed a lot of members of Hamas, but they've all been replaced, because that's the problem with these kind of organizations. You can kill people, but there'll be people readily standing up to replace them. So that has been a disastrous policy initiative from the Israelis. So clearly they're trying to start a second front. And that, I think, has been the tipping point with respect to why Iran responded. Now, we're not going to go into massive amounts of detail, but the long and short of it is, Iran last night fired around 200 missiles into strategic targets inside Israel, hitting military bases. They were supposed to have one landed near Mossad's headquarters, etc., etc. There was little civilian casualties. I mean, because then you can tell, not least because the Western media has not come out and made claims that lots of civilians were killed as a result of this. So they did strategically target military sites. What it highlighted, again, is the fundamental weakness of the Iron Dome's, obviously, missile defense system. The question is, to what extent was the missile defense system depleted, and those missiles need to be replaced? How quickly can they be replaced? So does that make Israel now vulnerable to another attack? Because the argument, quite legitimately, is what response is Israel going to make as a result of this? And Iran's made its position clear: if they respond by attacks on Iran itself, then they're going to come back far more forceful, they claim, than they did in this recent attack. So what are the options for Israel? Well, there was claims about them striking nuclear facilities. Well, apparently everybody except maybe the Israelis have said that is not to happen. The US has made its position very, very clear. And apparently there is ongoing discussions about whether they can target oil refineries. But obviously, if they do, then Iran will see that as a major escalation, and then they will respond accordingly. And who knows then what the outcome could be. So this is a pretty serious situation. I think a point worth making at this point with regards to the Israeli response, they did come out and said we're going to have an immediate response. Then we're not having an immediate response, which kind of suggests they were talking to the US, but to what extent is talking to the US going to make a scrap of difference? And we'll come on to Israeli relations with a whole bunch of countries shortly. We did see last night some Israeli strikes on Syria. There was claims which have to be substantiated that an ammunition depot near the Russian Hamim base, which is in the city of Jabla, was struck. Reports suggested the Israeli Navy was responsible and not the Air Force in carrying out the strikes in Syria. Well, that may, give some credence to what I've just said with regards to a lack of Israeli Air Force being available, because one of the strategic targets, or the claim is, that a number of F-35s were destroyed. Now, according to the Israelis, no F-35s were destroyed. The Iranians have said 20, so we don't know what the actual figure is, but potentially it's probably somewhere in between. So that may be why the Air Force weren't taking part in those strikes. So initially, that isn't like the Israeli response full stop, but it seems as though they just had to go out and do something to be seen to respond to, obviously, the Iranian missile strikes, which, again, as I said, seems to have surprised a lot of people in the West, to do with the level of precision, the way that the targets were clearly accurately hit, and clearly there was no intention to harm the civilian population. And that seems to have been, essentially, that objective has been met, because, as I said, there's been no claims in any Western media sources to the contrary. So this is obviously a situation now we wait, like we did in April, to see what the Israeli response will be. So I'll just pass over to you, Ken, and then I think we can just, carry on and discuss more points with regards to this whole war that threatens to become opening on a second and maybe even a third front.
Yeah, actually, in my opinion, the potential of 7-front war is revealing itself because of the fact that Israel has been at least able to do what it's going to do, because it's had really no response. Bombing Syria, going after and assassinating leaders, from whomever in Tehran, in Lebanon, making an incursion in Lebanon. When you take a look at all the different factions that could potentially retaliate against Israel, you're already talking 1, the Houthis; 2, what remains of Hamas; 3, Hezbollah; 4, Lebanon in joining their own military; Iran; the Arab Defense League may decide to come together in coalition; Turkey; and then, of course, if they get too close to Russian assets in Syria, Russia could get involved. So that's 8 fronts right off the bat.
More importantly than any is the Iraqi militias.
Iraqi militias.
So they are definitely would potentially do so. I mean, so yeah, you're absolutely right. That alone is potentially. I mean, I think sometimes some countries are making a lot of noise and probably ultimately won't do anything. But there are certainly amongst those a number that the threat, you could say, was certainly credible.
Exactly, because those are not only resources, and we're not talking movement to the front lines, but they can do a lot of damage with overt and covert type operations. They can supply arms to, if the Houthis are more than happy to be the front line and wave around, hey, look at us, we're doing this. There's multitudes of different avenues of which they can receive arms to be able to, do their damage and be the focal target. But I think the other thing that's standing out is the sudden fear that is hitting the Western powers, France, UK, United States, in regards to not really understanding the fullness of which Netanyahu has been willing to fight this conflict. And I think there is truly a fear that alliances made are going to drag them into a war that they don't want to do. And so, obviously there are things going behind the scenes. We had Starmer and Macron come out, and at least officially in the press, saying, "Hey, we're not getting involved in this." Obviously, Erdogan has made his presence known publicly. Putin has come out and has, he has tried as long as he could to keep that alliance they have with Israel, but he has officially said that, Israel needs to end this now, get out of Lebanon. And that's going to leave the United States, especially at a time when there is zero top leadership. Obviously, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris aren't going to be making any decisions. So it's going to be left with the State Department and the Pentagon to decide, hey, how much are we willing to stand with this, especially since we've already depleted ourselves in this Ukraine conflict, and we now have a port strike on the East Coast and a hurricane that's devastated the Gulf region. We've got massive problems in our own backyard that we really can't afford a month before an election to act like we don't care about things domestically and are instead wanting to join ourselves in a conflict that has nothing to do with us.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I would add to that is, and it's why I've said since October the 7th last year, the US does not want to go to war with Iran, and it needs a regional conflict like a hole in the head. And that has stood the test of time, and we're nearly 12 months ago to that day. And let's go through these nations. You're absolutely right. The UK and France have never got involved. They don't want anything to do with any escalation or any war in the region, because it's of no benefit to them to get involved in any way, shape, or form. They're making their position clear. The European Union doesn't want to get involved. You make a very good point with regards to Russia. Russia-Israeli relations are really just at the lowest point I think we've seen in a very long time, arguably ever. Almost the relationship has become persona non grata, because it's quite interesting to note that for whatever reason, Netanyahu wanted to talk to Putin, and apparently the discussion didn't happen. This was just a few days ago. And therefore, the other side to this whole relationship is the fact that Russia and Iranian relations are going from strength to strength, and Russia certainly has military technical cooperation with the Iranians. They've given them all sorts of S-400s, etc., and other military technology. There's no doubt they've been supplying the technology to them and continue to do so. There's been a lot of planes landing from Russia in Tehran for quite some time. The kind of transport planes, so it's self-evident what sort of military hardware they're transporting. The other point to make is that's really angered the Russians is the fact is the Israelis have been giving the Ukrainians weapons. So of course they're going to be furious about it. So that relationship is very damaged, and that is very bad news for the Israelis, because in some ways Russia's always been this kind of counterweight to problems. They've managed to convince the Iranians to exercise restraint. There have been a pretty positive influence to some extent on other regional players like the Iraqis, the Syrians, etc. Well, it appears now that the gloves are off, and effectively, the Russians' argument is Iran can defend itself and do whatever it needs to do to defend itself. So this is a huge change in relations in that regard. The other point is US-Israeli relations. They are certainly deteriorating. I know there are people who find that very surprising, but throughout the whole of this conflict, even with Hamas, and obviously now with Hezbollah, there was agreements apparently in place that have been reneged. and the US does not want a regional war because they will then feel duty bound to step in to defend Israel, not to act as an aggressor on behalf of Israel. They're very different things, and it's a hugely important distinction that needs to be made. But in the event of a major escalation, and the US then feels obliged to defend Israel, then the following risks apply to them. Firstly, they have enormous amounts of regional bases and important ones in West Asia. Well, Iran said they'll target them straight away. They'll also target all their aircraft carriers, whatever, that are in the East Mediterranean, the Gulf, wherever they may be. So that's another huge risk. The other thing is they could shut the Straits of Hormuz. If that happens, the price of oil will go to whatever it is, maybe $150 a barrel, and who knows, depending on how long they're closed, because at least 25% of oil transported through there. That can potentially cause huge problems and worse for the Western financial system. And the US knows it has no support amongst its allies in defending Israel. I mean, it's just look at the West Asia. All those countries are furious with the United States for providing arms to the Israelis through the Gazan war with Hamas. That's bad enough. So the US risks also becoming a pariah nation in the whole of West Asia. That is extremely bad initiative for the US to instigate through their own stupid policy decisions. So the US has a huge amount to lose and has nothing to gain. And I think then it's worth then moving on to the issue of the whole thing with Hezbollah and the claims, because there's been a lot of claims already made with regards to incursions by the Israelis that aren't true. There was claims that they had like 100,000 forces that had entered, and they were, already starting to conduct operations in southern Lebanon. Well, that transpired not to be the case. There has been a few Israeli forces entering into southern Lebanon. They've been repelled. There's been a number of killed. There's been tanks destroyed because Hezbollah has enormous amounts of anti-tank weapons. And the way their military is constructed, it's not some big centralized army. It's decentralized into small groups that are all over Lebanon. And given the terrain and the nature of how southern Lebanon is, it would be extremely difficult for the Israelis to succeed. I mean, they failed in 2006 and lost the war then, and Hezbollah is far better equipped now. So the risks to Israel are significant in doing this, and there is claims that it's a limited incursion and they're only achieving certain key objectives and then they're going to leave. Well, at the moment, they're not even vaguely approaching any of these objectives whatsoever. And of course, to try and defeat Hezbollah is going to be extremely difficult for them. And I think there was this idea, well, if we kill Nasrallah, then Hezbollah will fold. But Hezbollah is an institution. If someone dies for whatever reason, they just replace them. And yes, they lost a lot of senior military commanders at the same time when Nasrallah was killed. Well, they just replace them. There's people who just move up and take those positions over. And also, of course, from an Israeli perspective, what is very damaging to them is that whenever they have these incursions, if Hezbollah forces are killed, then there's plenty of people such as the Iraqi militias who are very keen to fill the places of those Hezbollah forces killed. So rather like they've had in Hamas, they've killed a lot of Hamas forces, but they've just been replaced. So there's as many Hamas forces now as there were on October the 7th. You can't just eradicate them. And that's why they've not succeeded in their initiatives and objectives with regards to Hamas. Remember, the Israelis claimed it'd be all over in 2 or 3 weeks or a month. Well, 12 months later, it hasn't. They haven't achieved any objectives. They've downscaled a lot of their activity there, and they're trying to then kind of make all sorts of claims that aren't true either. And then they've moved on to Hezbollah. But this, as much as anything, and this is what is causing enormous problems, is the United States has made a whole bunch of statements and tried to, and this will surprise people, and people will think this can't be true, but it is. They've tried to prevent escalations. Yes, they're responsible for arming Israel, that's true, but they don't want all these escalations, and Netanyahu just refuses to listen to them. So it's got to the point where relations between the US and Israel are very strained, and there are even reports in US mainstream media to that effect, and media sources that are normally has the ear of the intelligence agencies, which would suggest they're the ones putting these statements out. So the question is, to what extent is this damage going to affect Israel going forward? And we have to wait and see what the impact will be with regards to their retaliation to the Iranians, the airstrikes, and then we'll assess that going forward accordingly. But that is just another example of a situation where, the United States has no choice but to get involved in the sense of supporting Israel. But like I said, it's a hole in the head for them, and the immense damage it's doing in the process because Israel is suffering enormous just damage to its integrity, to its relations with its neighbors, to the broader world. And you only have to see where we're starting to see mainstream media sources in the West starting to report things in a way that doesn't present Israel in a particularly good light. You would never have expected that to happen. But we've reached this point where really the actions of, and it's particularly Netanyahu, who is really just fighting to save his political career. And in the process, he's causing immense damage to the nation state of Israel. And the problem is, depending on what the outcome of this could be, and if he opens up a second and third front, or then the consequences can be devastating for Israel as a nation state. And you could argue that this has very serious implications for it in the future. And another point I just wanted to mention briefly, Ken, is the whole problem with the Houthis, because as much as the Houthis have been firing at well in excess of 100 ships, and their claim is that it's anyone who supports Israel, or so whether it's Israeli ships, it's US ships, it's even been UK ships or ties to those countries. They've been firing missiles, sending armed drones, etc. There's claims they might be looking to accelerate and extend this operation in the Red Sea. And remember, there was all this huge claim from the US, we're forming a coalition and we're going to defeat the Houthis. Well, the US never got a coalition because no one wants to get involved. And the US basically is begging the Houthis to stop conducting these strikes because they've got no capability whatsoever to prevent them doing so. And this is why, again, the idea the US wants to go to war with Iran when it can't even defeat the Houthis is just proves it's a nonsense. And I think just one final point, and this is, they don't do this very often, but the Houthis actually also conducted a drone strike which hit Tel Aviv again. And they, again, this is an additional threat that the Houthis can, and they've done this before with regards to Israel. So that's another potential front or problem that could face Israel if this became a broader conflict, because the Houthis may get more involved in that capacity as well. And again, they've been totally misunderstood. Their capabilities vastly underestimated. They have a lot more capabilities than people realize, and they're very capable of manufacturing their own missiles. They don't need to rely on other countries to produce them. But they have demonstrated how they can basically gridlock all traffic that goes through the Red Sea. I mean, and if you look at the number of vessels transiting the Suez Canal, it's fallen by probably 60–70%. The risk is that could continue, and that has had huge problems as well, because vessels now have to take a much longer route around Africa, which has enormous expense and time considerations. So I think overall this highlights why we're in this precarious position. What happens now with regards to Hezbollah is one aspect. Their response to Iran is another aspect. But I think the issue is that for the United States, if Israel responds in a very aggressive way and targets Iran directly, then we're going to see a response from Iran. And then the question is, what's the fallout from that, and how does the US respond to that? Yes, it will respond in a defensive capacity, but we already know that because Iran's made its position pretty clear with regards to nations, if you are seen to be supportive, if you allow the Israelis to use your airspace, then we regard you as a legitimate target. And it's worth noting the Iranians went to Doha today with a meeting, and a number of the West Asian nations were very clear to say we're neutral, we're not involved in this. And the reason they're saying that is they don't want the Iranians targeting their oil refineries and other critical infrastructure, because they're seen as being supportive of Israel. So this is a very difficult situation for the United States. And again, it just highlights the reality of what's going on. And it's very, very different from the general perspective. And we've had a pretty unique position on this for a very long time. Don't think anyone else has said the things we've said, but so far what we've said has proved to be the case. And I think it validates the viewpoint that the US can support Israel, but there is red lines in how they support them. And I think the US now feels that it's being pushed past those red lines, and it is now extremely uncomfortable to await the outcome of the Israeli response, and then what a further Iranian response could be.
To wage war. And one of those key components is public support. You have to have public support to be able to sustain. And we already know there have been protests within Israel regarding conflicts, regarding the hostages, regarding a number of different things. The instability of the population to the government is there, and it can be fomented. So while the strikes that Iran did were ensured to have as minimal casualties in the public as possible, it did likely send a message to the people of Israel, we could get hit anytime, anywhere, and we're not as safe as, say, our government has been promising we have been along lines. Secondly, Israel does not have that big of a on the boots on the ground army military. They've already removed the law restricting the Orthodox from having to do military service. So just like in Ukraine, where they had to start bringing in more and more like younger people to become the troops, now the olders, the 45 to 60-year-olds, to be able to fight. If this gets extended and becomes an incursion that they want to do a ground war, they are not going to have the troops to be able to sustain this for any length of time, especially when you have internal conflicts going with a limited army and a coalition of nations that can put as much manpower as they want. They can supply as much weapons amongst each other at given points in the conflict that they need to. And of course, we have the 21st century version of the U-boat in drones that can keep ships, can keep arms, can keep aircraft from supplying any of these different places in the conflict. And I think the Houthis have proved that. Their missiles and their drones are the modern U-boats that take out the merchants before they can get deliver their stuff on shore.
Yeah, and just a final point, the biggest problem for the Israelis is Iran has hypersonic missiles, and there's no missile defense system in the Western world that can defend against them. So, that's the fundamental question that they need to be addressed before Israel considers any response whatsoever. And hopefully somewhere can make sure that cool heads in Israel are convinced of this, because otherwise the risks could end up creating an enormous conflict, and it will be utterly devastating for the Israelis in the process. And obviously anyone who has a scintilla or a grain of humanity in them would not want to see this happening, because there are always also going to be enormous consequences, because the risk is it spreads into the region and other countries get caught in the crossfire, and then it starts to become a massive problem. So we have to wait and see what the Israeli response will be, and then we'll assess it again accordingly.
Absolutely. And I just want to add one other thing that cropped in my head. I was thinking about this over the past week or so, and it just came up. At a certain point, when you have the advantage in any conflict, to be able to, especially one where you don't have unconditional war, when you have strength, and this is, we've heard this in the media over Ukraine, where, okay, this, by getting into Kursk, now Zelensky has a portion of strength that he can take to the negotiation table. After the attack into Gaza and Palestine, at certain points, probably a window of about 2 weeks, Netanyahu could have said, boom, okay, we've made our point. Let's go and negotiate and figure out and get this. And he could have gotten a lot of concessions at that point, because most of West Asia did not want to go to war, did not want to go to extend the conflict. Yes, Hamas and Hezbollah would have had to have been tampered down by the rest of the Arab League, but I think up to a certain point they would have gone ahead and did this. There were already talks about negotiations. However, Netanyahu did not take advantage of that window and instead pushed it. Now he's pushed these other West Asian countries in the Middle East to go beyond and say, now, you know what? We're no longer going to trust. We're no longer going to sit back, and we're going to go ahead and make sure that our objectives are done. And I think that's where Israel made the biggest mistake. I think the United States, smart people within military intelligence saw this mistake. And because of this, now it's going to go through to its final end. Whatever that is, I'm not going to speculate on that. But the initiative by Israel has long been lost. And now it's just a matter of what comes in the aftermath of that.
Yeah.
Anyway, Paul, I want to thank you as always for being a part of this great discussion.
And likewise.
And to everybody here at the Sirius Report community, thank you for all of your support. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, share with anybody you think is important. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.